Jim Jones was not born into greatness. He was not raised in power. He was not destined to lead. And yet, by the time his life reached its end, nearly 1,000 men, women, and children lay lifeless in a jungle clearing, all because they followed him. This is the story of how one man, through charm, deceit, and absolute control, led his own people to destruction. To understand how a man could command such deadly loyalty, we must begin at the very start, long before the People's Temple, long before Jonestown, long before the infamous words, "Drink the Kool-Aid," became synonymous with blind obedience. We begin in the small, unassuming town of Crete, Indiana, on May 13, 1931, the day James Warren Jones was born. His childhood was one of contradictions. He was raised in poverty, the son of a disabled World War I veteran, and a mother who believed her child was destined for something greater. While other children ran through fields and played games, Jim was different. He was obsessed with power. Even at a young age, he was drawn to the pulpit, to the idea of commanding an audience. He would study preachers, mimicking their voices, their gestures, their ability to hold a room in silence with just their words. And yet, behind his fascination with faith, there was something darker stirring. Jones had an unshakable fixation on death. He spoke of it often. He experimented with it. Some childhood friends would later recall disturbing stories, Jim performing mock funeral services for small animals, sometimes those that had died naturally, and sometimes those that had not. There were whispers that he had been the one to kill them, just to watch the process of grief, to see how people reacted to loss. Even as a child, Jones did not simply want to believe in a higher power. He wanted to be one. In his teenage years, his fascination with religion deepened, but so did his fascination with control. He studied the fiery sermons of revivalist preachers, but he also read the teachings of Karl Marx and Joseph Stalin. He saw faith not as a path to salvation, but as a tool, a means to unite, to mobilize, to dictate. He did not simply want followers, he wanted absolute devotion. By the time he reached adulthood, Jim Jones had made up his mind. He would create a movement of his own, one that blended religion with socialism, one that promised the poor and the oppressed a better life. He would start a church. But unlike others before him, he would not simply ask for faith. He would demand it, and he would test it. Again and again, until he was the only voice his followers could hear. Until they belonged to him, body and soul. It started with a simple idea, a church that welcomed everyone, regardless of race or background, a sanctuary for the outcasts, the downtrodden, the ignored. He would call it the People's Temple. And from the moment the doors opened, Jim Jones was no longer just a preacher. He was a leader, a savior, a god in the making. No one knew it yet, but the path had already been set. The man who would one day lead over 900 people to their deaths had just taken his first step. A church is meant to be a house of worship, a place of faith, a sanctuary. But for Jim Jones, the church was something far greater. It was a stage, a kingdom, a weapon. It was the first step in transforming himself from a mere man into a messiah. It began in the 1950s in Indianapolis. A small congregation, mostly working-class families, drawn to Jones' passionate sermons. He preached about unity, racial equality, and a better world. A world where black and white stood together as brothers and sisters, where the poor were lifted up, where no one suffered alone. It was an intoxicating message, and the people who heard it clung to it like salvation. Because in Jim Jones, they saw something different, something powerful, something absolute. But what they did not see, what they could not yet understand, was that Jim Jones' kindness came at a cost. It was not charity he offered, it was control. His church did not simply welcome people, it swallowed them whole. And before long, the People's Temple was no longer just a congregation, it was a movement, a force. Jones was not content with small victories. He wanted power, real power. And in a country still scarred by segregation and racial division, he knew exactly how to get it. He positioned himself as a champion of the oppressed, a voice for the forgotten. He marched alongside civil rights leaders. He opened soup kitchens. He fed the hungry. And the more good he did, the more people flocked to him, believing they had found a man who truly cared. A man who would fight for them. A man who would never betray them. But Jim Jones did not build his following on compassion alone. He built it on miracles. At least, That's what he wanted them to believe. His services became spectacles, grand performances where the sick were healed, the crippled walked, and the blind regained their sight. But it was all a lie, a carefully orchestrated illusion. His so-called healings were staged, his followers planted in the crowd, pretending to be cured by his touch. But no one questioned it. They wanted to believe. And Jones knew that once faith took hold, it was nearly impossible to break. As his following grew, so did his ambitions. He began reaching out to politicians, cultivating powerful allies. He moved his church to California, first to Ukiah, then to San Francisco, and finally to Los Angeles. By the 1970s, he had thousands of followers. He had money, influence, and most importantly, he had loyalty. Absolute, unquestioning loyalty. If Jim Jones told them the world was ending, they believed him. If he told them they had to sacrifice for the greater good, they obeyed. But Jones did not trust that loyalty, not fully. He needed to test it, to push it, to make sure that when the time came, his people would do exactly as they were told. And so he introduced a ritual, a test of faith. He called them White Nights. Late at night, he would gather his followers, warning them of threats, racists, the government, enemies who sought to destroy them. And then he would pass around a drink, a simple cup of liquid. He would tell them it was poisoned. He would tell them they had to die for the cause, and they would drink it. They did not know, at first, that it was just a test, that there was no poison at all. And when he told them they would live, that it had all been a drill, they wept with relief. But the message had been clear. Their lives no longer belonged to them. Their lives belonged to Jim Jones. And so, the People's Temple continued to grow. More followers, more control. But the more powerful Jones became, the more paranoid he grew. He saw enemies everywhere. The media began investigating him. Former members started speaking out. The government was watching. His empire was no longer safe. And so he made a decision. He would take his people away. Far away, to a place where no one could touch him, where no one could question him. A new world, a paradise. He called it Jonestown. Jonestown was supposed to be a utopia, a sanctuary, a place free from the corruption of the outside world. But for those who followed Jim Jones into the depths of the Guyanese jungle, paradise quickly became a prison. By 1974, Jim Jones had secured land in Guyana, deep in the rainforests of South America. A vast and isolated stretch of land, far from prying eyes, far from journalists, far from the government he claimed was hunting them. He promised his followers a self-sustaining community, a socialist Eden where race, class, and money had no power. He told them they would be safe. He told them they would be free. And so, one by one, they packed their lives into suitcases, said goodbye to everything they had ever known, and boarded flights into the unknown. But what they found upon arrival was not the paradise they had been promised. It was a labor camp, a settlement carved out of the unforgiving jungle, built on sweat, exhaustion, and fear. Hundreds of men, women, and children worked the land from sunrise to sunset, clearing fields, building structures, growing crops. The work was grueling, the heat suffocating, the food scarce. But even in the face of suffering, they clung to their faith. They believed in the vision of Jim Jones. At first there was hope. The people of Jonestown were pioneers, builders of a new world. They sang, they prayed, they labored together. But slowly, the cracks began to show. Jones, now deep in the grip of his own delusions, began to tighten his hold. The rules became stricter, punishments harsher. The outside world was completely cut off. No newspapers, no phone calls, no way to leave. Passports were confiscated, families were separated, and over everything Jones' voice rang out, day and night, over the loudspeakers installed throughout the compound. His sermons, his warnings, his threats. There was no escape from him, not even in sleep. And then there were the punishments. Anyone who questioned, anyone who resisted, anyone who spoke of leaving, Jones had a way of making them disappear. At first it was public humiliation, then beatings, then solitary confinement. Deep in the jungle, away from the watchful eyes of the world, Jim Jones was no longer just a preacher. He was a dictator. But perhaps the most insidious of all was the mind control. Jones kept his people exhausted, overworked, and constantly afraid. He staged fake attacks on the compound, claiming they were under siege. He orchestrated elaborate loyalty tests, forcing parents to choose between their children and the movement. He drugged dissenters, keeping them too weak to fight back. And always, always, he reminded them that there was no way out, that the world outside wanted to destroy them. That if they left, they would be hunted, tortured, killed. But even as his control seemed absolute, cracks were forming. People were whispering in secret. Some dared to dream of escape. And in America, their families, mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, were beginning to ask questions, beginning to demand answers. And soon, the world would come knocking. A United States congressman was on his way, flying into the heart of the jungle, determined to uncover the truth about Jonestown. Jim Jones knew what this meant. His empire was crumbling, his power was slipping, and soon, very soon, the end would begin. By 1978, Jonestown was no longer just a cult compound. It was a pressure cooker, seconds away from explosion. Jim Jones knew it. He could feel it. The paranoia that had always lurked beneath his sermons was now a raging fire. He saw enemies in every shadow. He heard whispers in the wind. And worst of all, people were beginning to doubt him. He could see it in their eyes. Some of them wanted to leave. But leaving Jonestown was not an option. No one walked away from Jim Jones, not alive. Back in the United States, desperate families of Jones followers were demanding action. Rumors of abuse, imprisonment, and mind control had reached the ears of politicians. And one man, Congressman Leo Ryan, decided to see the truth for himself. Ryan was no stranger to danger. He had built a reputation for exposing corruption, for putting himself in the line of fire. And now he was heading straight into the heart of Jonestown. Jones was livid. He had built Jonestown to be untouchable, a kingdom of his own, free from government interference. But Ryan's arrival meant that the outside world had not forgotten, that they were watching, that they were coming. Still, Jones knew he could not refuse. That would only confirm their worst suspicions. So, through gritted teeth, he extended an invitation. Ryan, along with a small group of journalists and concerned family members, arrived in Jonestown on November 17, 1978. The tension in the air was suffocating. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Followers moved with eerie obedience. And yet Jones put on a performance. They were greeted with music, with dancing, with a feast. Jones smiled. He spoke of love, of unity, of how his people had chosen this life freely. For a moment, it seemed to work. Ryan and the journalists saw a thriving community, a place where people seemed happy. But beneath the surface, something darker was stirring. That night, while the visitors rested, frightened whispers spread through the compound. Some followers, those who had been too afraid to speak before, began to slip notes into the hands of the journalists. Pleas for help. Desperate messages scrawled on scraps of paper. Get us out. Help us escape. We are prisoners here. The illusion was breaking. The truth was slipping through the cracks. By morning, the truth could no longer be denied. Dozens of members stepped forward. They wanted to leave. They wanted to go home. Congressman Ryan, shaken by what he had witnessed, promised them safe passage. He told Jones they were free to go. But Jones' smile had disappeared. His mask had cracked, and behind his dark glasses there was something else now. Something cold. Something lethal. Jim Jones had spent his life building Jonestown, bending the will of hundreds to serve his vision. And now, before his very eyes, it was falling apart. He could not allow that. He would not allow that. Not without consequences. Ryan and his group, along with the defectors, made their way to the airstrip. They thought they were leaving. They thought they were safe. They had no idea that Jim Jones had already given the order, that death was coming for them. As Congressman Leo Ryan and his group of defectors approached the small airstrip at Port Kaituma, there was a sense of uneasy relief. They had done the impossible. They had confronted Jim Jones. They had exposed the cracks in Jonestown's foundation. And now they were leaving. But what they didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that they would never make it home. Back at Jonestown, Jim Jones was unraveling. His control had been challenged, his authority had been questioned, and worst of all, people had dared to leave him, to betray him. And in the mind of Jim Jones, betrayal was unforgivable. If he could not keep them, then no one would. If they would not live for him, then they would die for him. He called for his most loyal guards, men who had been conditioned, broken, and rebuilt in his image. He gave them an order that would stain the jungle with blood. Kill them, kill all of them. At the airstrip, two small planes stood waiting, their engines humming in the humid Guyanese heat. Ryan and his team were helping the defectors board, checking names, making sure no one was left behind. And then from the trees, they came. A tractor with a trailer attached rumbled toward the airstrip. Inside, a group of armed men, Jones's personal death squad. They raised their rifles, and then chaos. Gunfire erupted, shattering the stillness of the jungle. Bullets ripped through flesh, through metal, through bodies thrown to the ground in terror. Congressman Ryan was shot first, collapsing as blood pooled beneath him. He had come to rescue the lost. Now he lay dying in foreign soil, his mission unfinished. The journalists were next. Some tried to run, some tried to take cover. It didn't matter. They were hunted like animals, gunned down without mercy. The defectors, those who had dared to dream of freedom, were slaughtered before they ever got the chance to leave. Screams filled the air, drowned only by the relentless crack of gunfire. And then, silence. 5 lay dead: Ryan, 3 journalists, 1 defector, others wounded, barely clinging to life. The gunmen did not stay to confirm the deaths. They didn't need to. The message had been sent. No one left Jonestown alive. But back in the compound, Jim Jones was not celebrating. His paranoia had consumed him whole. He knew what would come next. The world would hear of the massacre. The government would come for him. And there was only one way to stop them. If he could not control his people in life, he would control them in death. And so, as the bodies lay cooling on the airstrip, Jim Jones prepared for his final sermon. The last words his followers would ever hear. The last command they would ever obey. The sun was beginning to set over the jungle. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Back in Jonestown, Jim Jones sat on his throne, a simple wooden chair beneath the open-air pavilion. Jones's voice, once a beacon of salvation, now carried only doom. He told them that Congressman Ryan was dead, that the American government would invade, that soldiers would come storming into the jungle, slaughtering them all, ripping their children from their arms, that there was only one way out, a peaceful way, a painless way, a revolutionary way. They had to die. Together. The people shifted uneasily. Some murmured, some clung to their children. Some, those who had not yet lost themselves completely, looked for a way out. But there was none. Armed guards circled the crowd, their expressions blank, their fingers resting on triggers. No one was leaving. And then the poison was brought out. A large metal vat, filled with a mixture of cyanide, Valium, and fruit punch. Disposable cups lined up in neat rows, waiting to be filled. It was not the first time Jones had asked them to drink. They had rehearsed this moment before, but this time it was real. This time there would be no waking up. The children were the first. Mothers dipped cups into the vat, holding them gently to the lips of their babies, whispering soft reassurances as the liquid slid down their throats. Some drank willingly, trusting innocent. Others cried, screamed, fought against the hands that held them. It did not matter. They were forced to drink anyway. Their small bodies convulsed, limbs jerking violently as the poison took hold. Their cries became gurgles. Then silence. The adults followed. Some drank without hesitation, believing Jones' words, believing they were martyrs for a cause greater than themselves. Others refused, begged, pleaded, but refusal was not an option. Armed guards pushed them forward, forced cups into their hands, held guns to their heads. Some ran, trying to flee into the jungle, but they were chased down and shot. There was no escape. The poison was quicker. One by one, they collapsed, limbs twitching, foam bubbling from their lips. Some took minutes to die. Others suffered longer, gasping for breath as their organs shut down. The bodies piled atop one another. A sea of lifeless flesh sprawled beneath the Guyanese sky. More than 900 souls swallowed by death in a single night. And through it all, Jim Jones sat and watched. When it was over, when the last breath had been exhaled, when his empire lay in ruins at his feet, Jim Jones did not drink the poison. He did not suffer as they did. Instead, he took the coward's exit, a gunshot to the head. His body slumped in his chair, his kingdom reduced to nothing but corpses and silence. Jonestown was no longer a community. It was a graveyard. Morning light crept over Jonestown, revealing a sight that no human eyes were meant to see. More than 900 bodies, sprawled across the ground, motionless, lifeless. Mothers still clutched their children in a final embrace. Families lay side by side, frozen in death. The jungle, once alive with the sounds of birds and insects, had fallen silent. Even nature itself seemed to recoil in horror. In the heart of the massacre, Jim Jones's body lay slumped over in his chair. A single gunshot wound to his temple. He had preached death, demanded loyalty unto the grave, and yet, when the time came, he refused to suffer as his followers had. No convulsions, no agony, no slow descent into darkness, just a bullet, just silence. For nearly a full day, Jonestown remained untouched. No one came. No one knew. The world had no idea that, in a single night, an entire community had ceased to exist. But then, the first outsiders arrived, Guyanese officials, sent to investigate, after hearing reports of gunfire at the airstrip. What they found defied reason, defied belief. The sheer scale of it was unimaginable. Rows upon rows of bodies, their arms wrapped around one another, as if death had frozen them in their final act of love. Some were found clutching handwritten notes, their last words scrawled in desperation. Others had tried to flee, their bodies discovered deeper in the jungle, hunted down and executed. The smell of death hung thick in the air, and in the center of it all, Jim Jones's final sermon still echoed from the compound's loudspeakers, his voice recorded for eternity, a twisted lullaby for the dead. News of the massacre spread like wildfire. Within hours, the world knew the name of Jonestown. Newspapers printed shocking headlines: cult suicide, hundreds dead in jungle, death in Guyana, Jim Jones and his final command. Families, thousands of miles away, woke to find that their loved ones, mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, were gone. No goodbyes, no warnings. Just gone. The United States government scrambled to respond. The bodies needed to be identified, transported, returned home, if they could be. But there were too many. Too much death. Too much horror. Many were left in Guyana, buried in mass graves, unclaimed, unnamed, their identities swallowed by the tragedy. Others were flown back, their bodies arriving in coffins marked only with numbers. The questions came next. How had this happened? How had one man wielded so much control? How had no one stopped him before it was too late? Survivors, those who had escaped before the final night, spoke of the years of brainwashing, the isolation, the punishments, the fear. They told the world what it was like to live under Jim Jones, to wake every day knowing that death was not just a possibility, but an eventuality. But even with the answers, the horror remained. The tapes of Jones' final speech were played. His voice, smooth and hypnotic, urged his followers to step over into the next life, to die with dignity, to take their children with them. The world listened in stunned silence. It was madness, recorded in real time. Jonestown was no longer a place. It was a warning, a dark lesson carved into history, a reminder of how absolute power can twist faith into fear, hope into horror, devotion into death. And for those who had survived, for those who had walked away before the final night, one truth would haunt them forever. They had escaped, but Jim Jones would never leave them. Not everyone died in Jonestown. A handful of people, those who had seen the warning signs, those who had refused to be swallowed whole, had managed to escape. Some fled into the jungle on the final night, running for their lives as screams and gunfire filled the air behind them. Others had been away on errands, spared by pure chance. But even in survival, there was no victory. Only grief, only loss, only a question that would never leave them. Why them? Why had they lived while hundreds of their friends, their families, had perished? For those who returned to the United States, there was no warm welcome, no homecoming. There was only confusion, suspicion, and guilt. The world viewed them as brainwashed followers, as cult members, as accomplices to their own tragedy. They were interrogated, questioned, picked apart by reporters and investigators. Some of them, broken beyond repair, would never speak of Jonestown again. Others spent the rest of their lives trying to make sense of what had happened, searching for answers in a past that could never be undone. There was Odell Rhodes, who had seen the poisoned bodies piling up before him and knew he had to run. He walked away, silent, blending into the trees, carrying the weight of what he had witnessed for the rest of his days. There was Stanley Clayton, who saw the final moments unfold and, in a moment of pure survival, slipped into the darkness, stepping over the dead as he made his way out of hell. There was Hyacinth Thrash, an elderly woman who had fallen asleep in her cabin that night, unaware of the massacre happening just outside. When she awoke, the world she had known was gone. Everyone she loved, gone. And then there were those who lived but could never truly escape. Leslie Wagner Wilson, who ran with her young son into the jungle, knowing that if she stayed, neither of them would see another sunrise. She survived. He survived. But the ghosts of Jonestown followed her for the rest of her life. For the families left behind, the wounds never healed. The letters from Jonestown, once filled with hopeful words of a better future, became cruel reminders of a past they could not change. Some families spent years trying to understand how their loved ones had been pulled into Jim Jones' web, how faith had turned into fanaticism, how promises of salvation had led only to death. Others simply mourned, knowing there were no answers, only the empty spaces where their loved ones had once been. In the years that followed, the world dissected Jonestown from every angle. Psychologists, historians, religious scholars, all searching for meaning in the madness. But what they found was a truth as old as time. It was not faith that had killed the people of Jonestown. It was not socialism or religion or utopian dreams. It was one man's hunger for power, unchecked, unchallenged, allowed to grow until it devoured everything in its path. Jim Jones had not just built Jonestown. He had built a machine of obedience, fueled by fear, driven by absolute control. And when he was done with it, he burned it all to the ground. But for those who had lived, for those who had seen the horrors with their own eyes, one question would never leave them. One thought that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Could they have stopped it? Years passed, but the name Jonestown never faded from history. It became more than just a place, more than just a story. It became a symbol of blind devotion, of unchecked power, of a nightmare that should never have happened but did. And yet, even as the years wore on, even as the ruins of the compound were swallowed by the jungle, the echoes of that day refused to be silenced. For the families of the victims, Jonestown was an open wound that never healed. Every anniversary brought a flood of headlines. Every documentary replayed the horror. Photographs of the bodies, hundreds of them, face down in the dirt, were printed in newspapers, broadcast on television, dissected in history books. The world would never forget. But for those who lost their loved ones, remembering was not a choice. It was a life sentence. The United States government, forced to confront its failure to intervene sooner, faced public outrage. How had they ignored the warnings? How had they allowed a man like Jim Jones to build a following so large, so absolute, without stepping in? Investigations were launched, reports were written, but no amount of paperwork could undo what had already been done. The damage was irreversible. The dead could not be brought back. Some of Jones' most devoted followers, those who had helped enforce his rule, who had held the guns, who had mixed the poison, were arrested and put on trial. They claimed they had been brainwashed, that they had no choice. Some received prison sentences. Others, like Jones's wife Marceline, had already perished alongside the rest. And Jim Jones himself? He had escaped justice the only way he knew how, with a bullet. But the real trial, the one that mattered, was not held in a courtroom. It was in the minds of the survivors, the families, the world that watched and asked itself, how did this happen? And could it happen again? The answer was chilling. It already had, and it would again. Jonestown was not the first mass cult tragedy, nor would it be the last. Years later, the world would witness the fiery destruction of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. The Heaven's Gate cult in California, where dozens took their own lives under the command of another self-proclaimed prophet. The Order of the Solar Temple in Switzerland, another mass suicide orchestrated by a leader who claimed he alone held the truth. The pattern was always the same: a charismatic leader, a promise of something greater. Isolation, control, fear, and in the end, death. Jonestown did not just belong to history, it belonged to the future. A warning carved into time itself, a reminder of what happens when power is given to a man who believes himself to be a god. And yet, the most terrifying part of Jonestown was not the poison, not the guns, not the bodies scattered across the jungle floor. The most terrifying part was that it all begun with hope, with people searching for something better, for belonging, for purpose, and in that search, they had placed their faith in the wrong hands. Jim Jones did not kill them in a single night. He killed them slowly, over years, with words, with fear, with control. By the time he told them to die, they had already forgotten how to say no. And that is why Jonestown will never be forgotten, because somewhere, even now, there is another Jim Jones, another voice preaching salvation, another group searching for hope, and another tragedy waiting to happen. Jonestown is gone. The jungle has reclaimed its land, erasing the buildings, the paths, the signs of life that once thrived there. But the ghosts remain. The spirits of over 900 men, women, and children still whisper through history. Their fate, a chilling reminder of how easily faith can be twisted into fear, how quickly trust can turn into submission, how absolute control can lead to absolute destruction. The tragedy of Jonestown was not an isolated event. It was a pattern, a cycle that has played out before and will play out again. It is easy to look at history and believe we would never fall for something like this, that we are smarter, that we would see the warning signs. But the truth is, the people of Jonestown were not weak. They were not foolish. They were simply searching for something more. A purpose, a community, a place to belong. And in their search, they gave their trust to the wrong man. That is why remembering Jonestown is not just about honoring the dead. It is about protecting the living. It is about understanding the dangers of blind loyalty, of unchecked power, of leaders who demand obedience above all else. Because history has shown us one terrifying truth. There will always be another Jim Jones, another voice calling people to follow, another promise of a perfect world. And if we are not careful, history will repeat itself. If you found this story compelling, if you believe in learning from the past to protect the future, then subscribe to this channel. Here we uncover the darkest moments in history, the stories that should never be forgotten, the warnings that must be heard. Jonestown was one of many, but there are countless others, and together we can make sure they are never lost to time. Subscribe now, stay informed, because history is not just a record of the past, it is a lesson for the future.